He had seen every kind of performance imaginable, but when this man began writing love letters with flames that danced through darkness, Simon Cowell realized he was about to witness something that would redefine what it means to make the temporary eternal. The America's Got Talent Theater hummed with its familiar energy, cameras positioned to capture every moment of surprise and revelation that defined the show's appeal. Simon Cowell sat at the judges' table, his sharp attention scanning the stage with the practiced evaluation that had become his signature over decades of talent judging. The evening had progressed through its expected sequence of hopeful performers, each bringing their own interpretation of artistry to the stage. Singers had reached for vocal perfection, dancers had defied physical limitations, comedians had mined humor from human observation. Each act had contributed to the reliable rhythm that kept audiences engaged and judges alert to the possibility of discovering something unprecedented. Simon tracked the show's pacing, noting the acts remaining and the time allocated for each segment. Nothing in the previous performances had suggested that what was about to appear on stage would challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between beauty and impermanence, between art and destruction. His name was Gabriel Martinez, 42 years old, and he was carefully wheeling something onto the stage that looked more dangerous than artistic. A complex apparatus of metal stands, specialized fuel containers, and what appeared to be precisely calibrated flame control equipment filled a cart that he positioned with the careful attention of someone working with elements that could create either beauty or disaster. Gabriel wore simple black clothing that seemed designed to disappear against darkness, allowing whatever he created to exist without distraction from the artist himself. In his weathered hands, he carried a single photograph, its edges softened by years of careful handling, showing a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile that suggested laughter interrupted mid-moment. Behind Gabriel's equipment followed a team of fire safety technicians, their presence adding an element of serious preparation to what might otherwise have appeared to be an elaborate magic trick. This wasn't performance illusion, this was someone preparing to work with actual flame, actual heat, actual fire that could burn as easily as it could beautify. Gabriel had not always been someone who wrote with fire. 5 years ago, he had been a calligraphy instructor at a community college in Phoenix, teaching traditional penmanship to students who mostly wanted easy credits, but occasionally discovered unexpected passion for the ancient art of beautiful writing. Gabriel's own passion for calligraphy had developed during his marriage to Elena Martinez, a poet who believed that words deserved to be written as beautifully as they were conceived. Together, they had spent evenings practicing different scripts, Gabriel forming letters while Elena provided poetry worthy of elegant presentation. Words should look like what they mean, Elena had told him during one of their evening practice sessions, watching Gabriel craft her latest poem in flowing italic script. Love letters should be beautiful enough to match the love they carry. Their apartment had been filled with Gabriel's calligraphy, Elena's poems rendered in scripts that transformed words into visual art, holiday cards that became family treasures, love letters that Elena had saved in a wooden box she kept beside their bed. But Elena's battle with cancer had ended their shared evenings of words and letters. During her final months, Gabriel had written her daily notes, reminders of his love, memories of their time together, promises about the permanence of what they had built despite the temporary nature of her physical presence. Elena's last request had been unusual but specific. "I want you to find a way to write. That matches how I feel about our love," she had whispered during one of their final conversations in the hospital. Something bright, something that lights up darkness, something beautiful, that exists completely while it exists. Gabriel had promised, not understanding what she meant, but knowing that Elena's requests were never casual. After her death, he had found himself unable to return to traditional calligraphy. The permanence of ink on paper felt wrong somehow, too static for expressing the dynamic energy that had defined Elena's approach to life and love. The inspiration had come during a camping trip 6 months after Elena's funeral, when Gabriel had been sitting beside a campfire and noticed how flames moved in patterns that resembled letters, words, entire sentences written in light and heat. that existed for moments before transforming into new configurations. Gabriel had begun experimenting with controlled flame, learning to manipulate fire through specialized equipment that allowed him to shape and direct combustion with the same precision he had once applied to pen and ink. It had taken 3 years to develop what he called flame calligraphy, the ability to write words, sentences, entire letters using fire as his medium and darkness as his canvas. The technique required understanding flame behavior, fuel chemistry, and air current dynamics. Gabriel had studied with pyrotechnics experts, fire safety professionals, and even glass blowers who understood how heat could be shaped into temporary beauty. But more than technical skill, flame calligraphy required emotional precision. Fire responded to intention, to the writer's relationship with what was being written. Gabriel discovered that his most beautiful flame writing happened when he was creating text that carried genuine emotional weight. Love letters to Elena that would exist for moments before returning to darkness, but which somehow captured the essence of what he wanted to say more perfectly than any permanent ink could achieve. Gabriel's private performances in controlled outdoor settings had gradually attracted attention from artists and fire safety experts who recognized that he had developed something unprecedented, a form of writing that existed at the intersection of calligraphy, pyrotechnics, and emotional expression. Dr. Maria Santos, a professor of performance art at Arizona State University, had witnessed one of Gabriel's flame letters and immediately understood that she was seeing the development of an entirely new art form. Gabriel has created something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about text and permanence, Dr. Santos had written in her subsequent research paper. His flame calligraphy suggests that the most meaningful communications might be those that exist completely, for brief moments, rather than those preserved indefinitely. The invitation to perform on America's Got Talent had come through Dr. Santos's recommendation, but Gabriel had initially resisted the idea of taking his flame writing public. The letters he created were intensely personal communications with Elena, private expressions of grief and love that felt too sacred for entertainment context. But Elena's sister Carmen had convinced him that sharing his flame calligraphy could help other people understand something important about love, loss, and the ways beauty could exist in temporary forms. Elena always said that love letters should be as beautiful as the love they carry, Carmen had reminded him. Maybe other people need to see what that looks like, need to understand that the most precious things don't have to last forever to be perfect. Standing here in the wings of America's Got Talent, Gabriel understood that he was about to transform his most private art form into public performance, sharing with millions of strangers the technique he had developed for writing love letters to someone who could no longer read them. The stage manager approached him. "Gabriel, you ready?" Gabriel nodded, checking his equipment one final time and making sure his safety protocols were properly calibrated. He had performed flame calligraphy hundreds of times, but never on a television stage, never with an audience expecting entertainment rather than witnessing a man's conversation with grief. He positioned his equipment at center stage, surrounded by the specialized apparatus that would allow him to write with controlled flame, carrying Elena's photograph and 5 years of learning to transform sorrow into sentences written in fire and light. The audience's reaction was immediate curiosity mixed with concern. Here was equipment that clearly involved actual fire, real flames, genuine heat, in an enclosed theater space. Gabriel looked more like someone preparing for a scientific demonstration than entertainment, but there was something in his bearing that suggested profound, emotional purpose behind the technical preparation. Simon leaned forward, his attention caught by the obvious complexity and potential danger of what Gabriel was setting up. In 15 years of judging, he had never seen a contestant prepare to work with actual flame as their artistic medium. "Hello," Simon said, his voice carrying clearly across the theater. "What's your name, and what exactly are you planning to do with all that fire equipment?" Gabriel looked directly at Simon, his expression serious but calm. "My name is Gabriel Martinez, and I'm going to write a love letter using flame calligraphy, creating text with controlled fire that exists for moments before returning to darkness." The audience murmured with fascination and nervousness. This was unlike anything they had expected to see on a talent show stage. "You're going to write with fire," Simon said slowly. "Actual fire." Gabriel nodded, holding up Elena's photograph. "This is my wife Elena. She died from cancer 3 years ago. Before she died, she asked me to find a way to write that matched how she felt about our love. Something bright, something that lights up darkness, something beautiful that exists completely while it exists." Simon felt something shift in his understanding of what he was about to witness. This wasn't going to be a demonstration of pyrotechnic skill. This was a man who had developed an art form specifically to communicate with loss. "Flame calligraphy," one of the other judges said thoughtfully. "You create temporary writing using fire." "I create letters that burn as brightly as the feelings they carry," Gabriel replied. Elena always said that love letters should be as beautiful as the love they express. Fire seemed like the only medium that could match the intensity of what I wanted to tell her. Gabriel began activating his equipment, and the theater lights dimmed to allow his flame work to be clearly visible. Specialized fuel systems hummed to life, safety monitors confirmed optimal conditions, and Gabriel positioned himself behind apparatus that looked part artist's easel, part controlled combustion laboratory. "I'm going to write the last love letter I never got to give her," Gabriel said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet theater. "Words I've been trying to say for 3 years, written in the only language that feels adequate for expressing how much she meant to me." Simon found himself holding his breath as Gabriel began to work. The first flame appeared as a single point of light in the darkness above the stage, but as Gabriel manipulated his equipment with practiced precision, that point began to move, leaving trails of fire that formed recognizable shapes. Letters, words, entire sentences written in light against the blackness. "My dearest Elena," Gabriel wrote, his hands controlling fuel flow and flame direction with the delicate precision of a master calligrapher, each letter taking shape in fire before slowly fading as the next letter began to form. The audience watched, mesmerized, as words literally made of flame appeared and disappeared in the space above the stage. This wasn't illusion or trick photography. This was actual text created from actual fire, existing for moments before being replaced by new sentences that continued Gabriel's letter to his deceased wife. "I know you can't read this," Gabriel continued writing, each word burning bright before fading into memory. "But I needed to tell you that love doesn't end when life does. It just finds new ways to express itself." Simon was completely absorbed in watching someone create the most temporary art form imaginable. Each word existed for only seconds, but the cumulative effect was powerfully emotional. A love letter that could never be preserved, never be reread, but which somehow captured the ephemeral intensity of grief and continuing love. Gabriel's technique was flawless, his control over flame behavior absolute. But what made the performance extraordinary was the obvious emotional authenticity behind each flaming word. This wasn't demonstration. This was genuine communication. A man using fire as his pen to write letters to someone who existed only in memory and love. "You taught me that beautiful things don't have to last forever," Gabriel wrote in flames that danced across the darkness. "They just have to exist completely while they have the chance." As Gabriel's flaming text continued to appear and fade, the audience began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just technical mastery over fire, but the development of an art form that perfectly matched its emotional content. Love letters written in fire that burned as intensely as love itself, existing fully for brief moments before transforming into light and memory. Gabriel reached the climax of his letter, flames forming words that seemed to burn brighter, last longer, carry more emotional weight than the earlier sentences. "Thank you for teaching me that love is like fire. It doesn't ask permission to burn, it doesn't apologize for being brief, it just gives all its light while it can." The final words of Gabriel's flame letter hung in the darkness for what felt like eternity, but was probably only seconds, then slowly faded until the stage was dark again, leaving only the memory of text that had existed nowhere except in the space between Gabriel's grief and the audience's witness. The silence that followed was profound. The audience seemed unsure whether to respond with applause or something more reverent. What they had just witnessed felt too sacred for ordinary entertainment acknowledgement. Then Simon did something unprecedented. He stood up from the judges' table, not to speak or evaluate, but simply to honor what Gabriel had created. The rest of the judges followed, then the entire audience. But they weren't applauding. They were standing in respectful silence for someone who had just shared the most intimate conversation with loss that any of them had ever witnessed. After a moment that felt like a prayer, Simon began to applaud, slowly, deliberately, the sound carrying clearly through the quiet theater. But this wasn't entertainment applause. This was recognition applause. Acknowledgement of something that transcended performance and became pure human expression. Gabriel stood behind his equipment, surrounded by the lingering heat and smell of controlled combustion, holding Elena's photograph and watching Simon approach the stage. Simon climbed onto the stage and walked to where Gabriel waited, stopping beside the apparatus that had just been used to write the most beautiful, temporary text Simon had ever seen. "Gabriel," Simon said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to tell you something." Gabriel waited, uncertain whether Simon's response indicated success or confusion about how to categorize what had just been shared. "In 15 years of judging talent competitions," Simon said, "I have never seen a more perfect marriage between art form and emotional content. You didn't just write with fire, you found the only medium that could adequately express what you needed to say." Simon looked at Elena's photograph in Gabriel's hands. "Your wife asked you to find a way to write that matched how you felt about your love. Fire was the perfect choice. Beautiful, intense, impossible to ignore while it exists, but also temporary, transforming into light and memory rather than permanent record." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears, but he was smiling. "You've created something extraordinary," Simon continued. "Not just a new performance art form, but a way of communicating with loss that honors both the intensity and the temporality of what we feel when we love people we can't keep." Simon turned to address the entire theater. "Ladies and gentlemen, Gabriel Martinez has just demonstrated something profound about the relationship between beauty and permanence. He's shown us that the most meaningful communications might be the ones that burn brightest and fade fastest, leaving only the memory of their intensity." As the golden buzzer activated and confetti began falling around them, Simon gestured to the space where Gabriel's flame letter had existed moments before. "Your love letter to Elena will never exist again in exactly that form," Simon said, "but everyone who witnessed it will carry the memory of those words written in fire. That's not temporary. That's eternal." After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon spent time with Gabriel, learning more about his journey from traditional calligraphy to flame writing, and the grief that had inspired him to create art from fire. "You know what moved me most about your performance?" Simon asked. "It wasn't just the technical mastery, though that was remarkable. It was watching you use an art form that perfectly matched your emotional state. Temporary, intense, impossible to preserve, but absolutely unforgettable while it existed." Gabriel carefully packed his equipment. The apparatus that had allowed him to write Elena's letter, still warm from recent use. Elena always said that love letters should be as beautiful as the love they carry. Fire seemed like the only medium that burned bright enough to match what I felt. Simon realized he had learned something profound about the relationship between art and impermanence, about how the most beautiful expressions might be the ones that exist completely for brief moments rather than those preserved indefinitely. 6 months later, Gabriel established the Elena Martinez Institute for Flame Calligraphy, teaching others how to use fire as a medium for expressing emotions too intense for traditional writing materials. The institute worked with grief counselors, hospice programs, and anyone dealing with loss who wanted to learn how to write letters that burned as brightly as their feelings. Students learned to write messages to deceased loved ones, to express gratitude in letters that existed only in flame and memory, to create temporary text that honored the intensity of human emotion without trying to make permanent what was essentially about transformation and release. Simon's foundation provided funding for the Institute's research into therapeutic applications of flame writing. They discovered that creating temporary text with fire helped people process grief, express emotions that felt too large for conventional writing, and understand that love could continue even when its physical expressions were necessarily temporary. Gabriel's technique evolved to include collaborative flame letters, where multiple people could contribute to single pieces of text, creating shared expressions of loss, celebration, or community connection that existed for moments before transforming into collective memory. The Institute's most powerful program worked with families facing terminal illness, teaching them to write flame letters together, messages that existed for moments but captured years of love, promises written in fire that honored both the intensity and the limited time of their relationships. Years later, when Gabriel was invited to return to AGT as a guest expert, he brought a new development: the ability to create flame text that could be viewed by remote audiences, allowing people to participate in flame calligraphy sessions from anywhere in the world. During that return performance, Gabriel wrote a new letter to Elena, but this time it was also a message to everyone who had learned to use fire as a medium for expressing love, loss, and the full intensity of human emotion. Love taught me that the most precious things are the ones that burn brightest and fade fastest, Gabriel wrote in flames that danced across the stage, leaving only the light of their memory to guide us toward more love, more beauty, more willingness to let our hearts burn completely while we have the chance. The words faded into darkness, but their meaning remained, carried by everyone who understood that Gabriel had created more than an art form. He had demonstrated how to transform grief into beauty, how to honor loss through creation, and how to write letters that burned as brightly as the love they carried. The fire that had consumed Gabriel's words had also illuminated something essential about human connection: that the most meaningful communications often happened in the space between permanence and impermanence, where love letters could be written in flames that existed completely for brief moments before returning to the light from which they came. Gabriel's flame calligraphy had proven that beauty didn't require permanence to be meaningful, that art could exist in the space between creation and destruction, and that sometimes the most perfect way to preserve love was to let it burn bright and free, trusting that its light would continue to illuminate hearts long after the flames had faded. It wasn't just television that night, it was a masterclass in the art of letting go, a demonstration that love could be expressed in forms that honored its temporary intensity rather than trying to make permanent what was essentially about transformation, and proof that sometimes the most beautiful letters are written in fire and memory, burning bright enough to light up darkness before returning to the eternal flame from which all love emerges. Elena's final wish had been fulfilled. Gabriel had found a way to write that matched the intensity of their love, creating letters that burned as brightly as the feelings they carried, existing completely while they existed before transforming into the kind of light that never really dies. In the weeks following Gabriel's performance, the video of his flame calligraphy became a phenomenon that transcended typical entertainment content. Art schools worldwide began studying the footage for its demonstration of how traditional art forms could be reimagined through unconventional materials. Gabriel received hundreds of letters from people who had lost loved ones, but one particularly moved him from Dr. Sarah Kim, a hospice counselor in Seattle. After watching your flame letter to Elena, I realized that many of my patients struggle with how to express feelings that feel too intense for traditional forms of communication. Would you consider teaching flame calligraphy as a therapeutic technique? The Elena Martinez Institute for Flame Calligraphy grew from Dr. Kim's suggestion. Gabriel's first workshop with hospice patients was held at Seattle Children's Hospital, working with families facing pediatric terminal diagnoses. When you're losing a child, there are things you want to tell them that feel too big for regular words, explained Maria Santos. Writing with fire felt like the only way to match the intensity of what I was feeling. Maria had written a flame letter expressing love and promises about how her daughter would be remembered. The letter existed for only minutes, but accomplished something months of traditional therapy hadn't achieved. Watching those words burn and transform into light made me understand something about letting go, Maria explained. Not letting go of love, but letting go of the need to hold on to what was changing. Gabriel's technique evolved as he worked with different populations dealing with loss. He developed methods for families writing collective flame letters, for children expressing feelings about absent parents, for veterans communicating with deceased comrades. The Institute's research program, supported by Simon's Foundation, began studying the psychological effects of temporary art creation on grief processing. Dr. Jennifer Chen conducted the research. Participants who engaged in flame calligraphy showed significantly different patterns of grief processing, Dr. Chen reported. Creating temporary art that burned and transformed seemed to help people understand that grief itself could be transformed rather than simply endured. Gabriel's most challenging project came when the September 11th Memorial Foundation commissioned him to create a flame calligraphy installation for anniversary commemoration. The installation, Letters to Light, featured dozens of flame writing stations where families could create temporary messages. Hundreds wrote flame letters throughout the day, expressing grief, sharing updates, many simply saying, "I love you," in letters made of fire and memory. "It was the first time since my husband died that I felt like I could really talk to him," said Jennifer Walsh. Regular writing felt too small, but writing with fire felt like it could reach wherever he is now. Gabriel began traveling internationally, teaching flame calligraphy to communities dealing with collective loss. In each setting, he discovered that flame writing transcended cultural barriers. The experience provided a universal language for expressing emotions beyond conventional communication. Gabriel's personal practice continued alongside his teaching. Every month, on Elena's death anniversary, he would create a new flame letter, sharing memories, describing current experiences, always expressing the continuing love that her death had not diminished. Years later, when Gabriel was diagnosed with terminal illness, he began creating his final letter series, flame writings exploring his approaching reunion with Elena, while expressing gratitude for the years of connection that flame calligraphy had provided. Gabriel's last public performance was at the Elena Martinez Institute, where he wrote his final flame letter to Elena in front of hundreds of students and people whose lives had been touched by his work. "My dearest Elena," Gabriel wrote in flames that seemed to burn brighter than any he had created before, "I'm coming home soon, and I want you to know that every flame letter taught me something new about the love we shared. You taught me that beautiful things don't have to last forever," Gabriel wrote in the final lines. "They just have to exist completely while they have the chance. Thank you for teaching me how to love like fire, burning bright, transforming everything it touches, and returning to the eternal flame from which all love comes." Gabriel passed away 2 weeks later, but his legacy continued through hundreds he had taught to write with fire. Thousands who had found healing through creating temporary art that burned as brightly as their emotions. The Elena Martinez Institute continued operating, demonstrating that love could be expressed in forms honoring its transformative power, that temporary beauty could be more meaningful than permanent preservation, and that sometimes the most perfect way to honor love was to let it burn bright and free, trusting that its light would continue illuminating hearts long after the flames had returned to the eternal fire from which they came.